Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Intro to Mass Communication. I am Professor Cyrus Satzes, and this week we're going to be talking about media effects. So why don't we get to the slideshow and get started? So first things first, just a recap of what we covered last week. We talked about the definitions of three important terms: mass communication, mass media, and culture. We briefly discussed the history of mass media. The textbook obviously covers that much more in detail. We investigated the explosion of technology upon each medium, identified the meaning of an information society. That was largely in the textbook. Determined the effects of mass communication upon behavior and politics, distinguish the processes and theories of mass communication in today's world. Last week we talked about gatekeeping theory. Today we're going to delve into agenda setting theory. And we discussed media literacy and some steps you can take to discern what is trustworthy, valid content and what isn't. I introduced you, I'm sorry, to the media literacy test. So first things first, I talked about propaganda last week. The textbook revisits this subject extensively for the simple reason that it is vitally important and that so much of the media content you consume is propaganda. The textbook definition of propaganda is manipulation of information to influence public opinion. You see a lot of propaganda from politics especially, but it's really across the board. And it's almost always driven largely by a profit motive. And again, these are some examples I showed you last week of really old school methods of propaganda from World War II propagandic posters. So media and behavior is discussed in the textbook, and one theory correlating with that is cultivation theory. The definition of cultivation theory, at least based on the text, is that the more time people spend living in the television world, the more likely they are to believe that social reality aligns with the reality portrayed on television. Now, in this modern era where technological advancements have obviously altered the way we consume media, so especially with mobile devices and the internet, you can substitute the term television in this case for basically really any visual mediums that you're consuming. And there's been a lot of research based on cultivation theory. Some studies show that young people who play violent video games report angry thoughts and aggressive feelings immediately after playing. And studies do confirm this. It's a huge reason why, especially young people, it is strongly recommended to restrict them from consuming media content that is violent or sexual. And studies do confirm that to a certain degree, cultivation theory has validity to it based on the behavior of individuals who consume this kind of media content. And there's also a correlation between the amount of time spent playing violent video games and increased incidences of aggression. However, cultivation theory is not empirical, meaning that there is also research conducted that shows different results and different effects of the type of media consumed on an individual's behavior. So, for example, if an individual is typically prone to violent acts, they are drawn to violent media. But by keeping these individuals, let's say in a movie theater, or keeping these individuals at home consuming this media, violent media may actually contribute to a reduction in violent social acts. Sometimes other studies have also shown that violent media serves as an escape for individuals who are prone to violent acts, thus allowing them to release the inherent behavior by consuming that media instead of actually acting it out. And one thing that is, if not empirical, really close to empirical, it's young people who have heavy exposure to sexually themed media, whether it's movies or music, are twice as likely to engage in early sexual behavior as young people who have light exposure to it. So while it is not an entirely black and white issue when it comes to violence, simply because, again, some people are inherently violent, and violent media serves as a sort of escape or release for them, or at a minimum, they're spending time consuming the media and not acting on those impulses and urges. The same cannot necessarily be said for young people when it comes to sexually themed media. It seems to be universal that when young people consume sexually themed media, they oftentimes tend to engage in early sexual behavior. So that is a huge reason why both violent and sexual media content is restricted when it comes to young people consuming it. The textbook also talks about cultural stereotypes. And this is a very serious issue when it comes to media that's produced, consumed. And later in this semester, we're going to talk about a concept called cultural hegemony, which is where a lot of these stereotypes are based in. And we'll cover that later in the semester with future lectures. But when it comes to cultural stereotypes, they are rampant in the media. And television and magazines from the mid-20th century often portrayed, for example, women in a submissive domestic role that both reflected and reinforced these cultural limitations imposed on women. And the show Mad Men highlights a lot of those very negative and quite frankly, immoral acts that used to be very normalized in the media. And by it being normalized in the media, it oftentimes legitimized that type of behavior in reality. And it's not just with gender, it's also obviously applied to race and so much more. An example of that being Aunt Jemima and the Cream of Wheat chef. They similarly reflected and reinforced a submissive domestic servant role for the African American community. And what's really appalling is that these two have just recently been removed as the symbols, as the logos for these products. I mean, Aunt Jemima and the Cream of Wheat chef until a year ago were still on the boxes and still in advertising. Before finally there was enough people speaking out against it that they decided to finally take those down. But again, those two characters are examples of the media presenting cultural stereotypes that help normalize these stories, these stereotypes when it comes to individual behavior in society. And as we move on, so this is one of the three really prominent impactful theories in mass communication. And for students watching this video, this is especially important because you're expected to obtain a firm grasp of these theories. Last week, we talked about gatekeeping theory. So chapter 2 covers agenda setting theory. And the third theory, and we'll cover this later in the semester, is framing theory. But agenda setting theory is defined scholarly as a transfer of salience from the media agenda to the public agenda. Or in layman's terms, the media's agenda sets the public's agenda. And really what the best explanation for agenda setting is this. The way we perceive what is important in society, in the world around us, is based largely on the media that we consume. I don't know if this is a great example, but if you never knew about the COVID-19 pandemic, if you do not consume media coverage of the pandemic, of the virus itself, of governmental societal reactions to it, you wouldn't even know about it. And it would not be something that you would consider to be important. You would just go on living your daily life and it would not affect you in any regard. But because the media constantly puts these certain things at the top of their front pages or the top of their websites, if it's a radio show, it would be like the first story talked about. If it's a TV show or TV news program, the first thing talked about. By the media putting this priority on it, we as a society consume that and therefore decide, oh, wow, this really is important. And that's agenda setting in a nutshell. And I'll show you a lot of examples of this because each individual media organization sets forth a different agenda for their audience. And a profit motive is almost always the biggest reason for the initiative behind media organizations, I guess, setting forth this agenda. And some examples of this to maybe give you a better understanding is if you go to the front page of two very ideological news organizations on different sides of the spectrum, right? So safe to say MSNBC is a very largely liberal media organization, whereas Fox News is largely conservative. Although studies show amazingly that when you focus on just the news reports from these organizations, they are very objective. It's just neither organization tends to focus on news reporting and instead tends to focus largely on propagandic content. So, and these two front pages were taken at the exact same moment on the exact same date. And it goes to show that each media organization has a different agenda. Another example of agenda setting theory, and for the students watching this, if you have a discussion post, you will be required to show me 2 examples. Another example is the front page of, let's say, the San Francisco Chronicle versus the front page of the LA Times, right? 2 fairly prestigious news organizations, legacy media organizations that go through the peer editing process before publishing content, meaning the author of the story, the journalist, does not just have a carte blanche freedom to publish whatever they want. It oftentimes goes through numerous editors for fact checking, for grammar, spelling, punctuation, to verify that the information presented in that story is valid. But nonetheless, if you go to the front page of the LA Times or the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, you're probably going to see 2 very different top stories unless there is a major national story going on. And the reason for this is because for the LA Times or for the San Francisco Chronicle, their agenda is oftentimes largely geographical, right? They're aiming their coverage for a certain region. And so that's their agenda in terms of what is most important, right? And the people consuming that, if they see something as a front page headline news story, they're going to think, oh, wow, the media consider this important. So now I'm going to think this is important. And that's agenda setting for you in a nutshell. Another theory that the textbook covers is called uses and gratifications theory, which basically states that consumers use the media to satisfy specific needs or desires. This might seem kind of obvious to you. So this isn't a complicated theory to grasp. And the examples of the specific needs or desires that the media fulfills includes relaxation, right? Sometimes you might just consume media just to relax. Social interaction, that's especially true with social media. Entertainment, right? Whether it's a movie or a TV show, you're just looking at it again as an escape from whatever mundane acts or stressful acts are going on in your life. Maybe arousal. Porn does remain the #1 type of content for all online sources. I mean, it's literally like the #1 type of content produced on the internet is porn. So arousal is a huge part of that. Obviously, there might be an escapism, right, where you just want to escape from reality. And there's a whole host of interpersonal and social needs that fit in terms of what consumers use the media for. The textbook also talks about symbolic interactionism. If you're a student, please don't worry about this for any of your exams, but the textbook covers this, and I just want to kind of add on to it so you have a better understanding of what it means. Because the textbook defines symbolic interactionism as the self is derived from and develops through human interaction. And I show a picture of Mercedes-Benz here because what symbolic interactionism basically means is that when you consume media, and especially advertisements, it also could be a show, what you see displayed in the media, human beings oftentimes kind of translate that to whatever that item is, that's what they need to feel fulfilled, right? So for example, when you see a commercial of a Mercedes-Benz and you see a successful individual driving the car, you might think to yourself, oh, wow, I need that Mercedes so that I can feel the same way that person feels, right? Symbolic interactionism is really rooted in advertising largely because that is one of the goals of advertising is to make you feel like you're left out, make you feel like you want something so that you can feel fulfilled. And to do so, you do that through various items and objects, whatever these symbols are, so that way you feel fulfilled. And thus you kind of identify with it and your self is formed and developed from that. Now, free speech, we talked about this last week, has its limitations. All right. So the First Amendment, while it is one of the most tremendous pieces of legislation ever written in human history in terms of the freedom that it grants individuals, it still does have limitations. All right. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of the press, for example, but obscenity is not protected, okay? And when we talked about community last week, this is a huge reason for that. Obscenity depends on the community that the media is being distributed to and disseminated to. So for example, something that might seem obscene in Texas might not seem obscene in California, as an example. And there's also various languages and more specifically words in the English language that are not allowed. George Carlin's done a great bit about that, the 7 deadly words that you can't use. Another thing not protected by the First Amendment is copyright law. That too is not protected by the First Amendment. And again, propaganda, the textbook constantly revisits this term because of how important it is and because of how much of it there is in the media. And again, propaganda defined as communication that intentionally attempts to persuade its audience for ideological, political, or commercial purposes. And again, I'll show you these one more time, the posters from World War II as examples of propaganda. The textbook also briefly touches on media logic theory. This is another one that is not very complicated. And the definition of media logic theory is that common media formats and styles serve as a means of perceiving the world. This is kind of in tune with agenda setting, only where instead of what we consume tells us what's most important and what to prioritize, media logic theory states that what we consume in the media defines what reality is for us. And there is a lot of truth to this because we cannot literally be in every place in the world at once. Oftentimes we can never visit most places in the world. So we use the media to understand what's going on in the world around us. And so that's what media logic theory is, that what we perceive as reality is based largely on what we consume from the media itself. And so when I went to graduate school, one of the first things my professors told me is that journalism and academia are incredibly synonymous, just in the sense that whether you're a journalist or whether you're a professor, in both fields, you're seeking the truth, right? You're conducting research to find answers to questions, and that question oftentimes leads to a hypothesis, and then you're either trying to prove that hypothesis, or you find that your hypothesis is disproved, but regardless, you're finding answers, right? And there's different methodologies, different ways to conduct media research. One form is content analysis, and this is a research technique that involves analyzing the content of various forms of media. So one example of this, my graduate school master's thesis was based on how the media covered Jackie Robinson back in the 1940s when he broke the color barrier. And it was a comparative analysis between how the media covered Jackie Robinson in the 1940s versus how the media was covering two prominent gay athletes, the first two who came out in one of the four major sports, right? In Major League Baseball, the National Hockey League, National Basketball Association, and the National Football League. And so the two gay athletes were Michael Sam and Jason Collins. And so I had to use content analysis, especially for Jackie Robinson, where I was analyzing various content that was produced by media to see if there was any bias in the content or to see if there was racism or any form of language that was not objective, right? And I had to do that using content analysis. And oftentimes when we do content analysis in the scholarly field, we're looking for code words and trying to find those throughout, like words that indicate for or against the hypothesis that we're doing research on, right? And that's content analysis. You're just reading a lot of articles to look for specific words or phrases in there. Archival research is a methodology of media research, and this is reviewing historical documents such as old newspapers and past publications. I had to do this extensively for my Jackie Robinson research because of how long ago he played in the 1940s. I was fortunate in the sense that there were other scholarly articles published that did similar research, and I could base my research off theirs, but I still did have to do a lot of archival research. Surveys are one of the most common forms of media research. It's a descriptive survey aimed to find the current state of things, right? Usually these are questions you ask subjects. Sometimes the questions are scaled with numbers. They could be true or false. And sometimes there might be more detailed questions. It just depends on what you're researching, what the subject matter is. But at some time or another, I'm guessing everyone watching this video has conducted a survey of their own. And last but not least is interviews. And this is research where specific questions are asked of participants to gain a fuller understanding of the participants' perceptions and experiences. So these are the four methodologies of media research. And there's two kinds of research, okay? And the textbook covers this as well. There's quantitative research and there's qualitative research. When I did my master's thesis, my research was qualitative, and I'll explain what each of these means in just a moment. So quantitative research is defined as the systematic empirical investigation of observable phenomena by statistical, mathematical, or computational techniques. In more layman's terms, quantitative research just focuses on numbers or finds answers that are not disputable. That they're, when I say empirical, that means it's like absolute, right? Whereas qualitative research investigates the why and how of decision making, not just the what, where, when, or who. To give an example of the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research, let's say you're conducting either a study, or maybe you're a journalist writing a report on the homeless crisis in downtown Los Angeles, for example. If you're doing quantitative research on the story, you'd be conducting research on how many homeless people there are. You might want to do a demographic breakdown in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of age. You might ask them how long they've been homeless. You're asking questions that have empirical answers to it, right? That have quantitative answers to it. Now, if I was going to be conducting qualitative research on this same subject, I would be conducting interviews with homeless individuals, asking them, why are you homeless? How did you become homeless? That's a qualitative side of research, where it's not necessarily black and white, but it's more gray, where each answer can be different. You might not come up with empirical answers, but reality is complex. Not everything is simple, obviously. So sometimes that is the only form of research you can conduct. And when you're doing qualitative research, your methodology is ethnographic, right? And the term ethnography is a systematic study of people and cultures. And when you're studying people and cultures, at that point, you're mostly doing qualitative research. And this applies both to scholars and to journalists. So that is it for this week. You learned about media effects, and I hope that was informative. And yeah, I'll see you all next week for the next subject. Thank you very much.